Julian Vance was 42 years old when he came home from his own job site to find his suitcases scattered across the front lawn. He'd spent 12 years building his wife Tony's entire lifestyle, the house, the cars, the charity gala wardrobe, never once asking for credit. He'd trusted his best friend Preston with equal shares in the company they'd built together. That afternoon, standing on his own driveway, Julian discovered exactly what that trust had cost him. Tony was on the porch, screaming that the house was hers now, that he needed to leave. Preston's car idled at the curb like he already owned the address. What neither of them knew was that Julian had spent the last 2 weeks quietly documenting 4 years of theft, forgery, and betrayal, and he hadn't come home alone. As Tony's voice cracked into a final, "Get out!" 10 black SUVs pulled up behind him, and Julian simply crossed his arms and waited. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The sun hadn't fully cleared the tree line when Julian Vance stepped onto the job site. The air smelled like fresh-cut lumber and wet dirt. Heavy equipment groaned in the distance. 24 workers moved through the half-built frame of what would become a 4-story mixed-use building on the east side of town, and every single one of them knew exactly who had just walked through the gate. "Footing on the north wall looks shallow," Julian said to his site foreman, not looking up from the blueprint in his hands. His voice was low and even. No drama, just fact. "Pull your crew off the pour until I check the grade myself." The foreman nodded and moved without question. That was how it worked with Julian. He didn't bark orders, he didn't perform authority. He'd spent too many years in the dirt himself, mixing concrete at 5 in the morning, running a single beat-up truck to 3 jobs in one day, eating lunch standing up because there wasn't time to sit, to feel the need to prove anything on a job site he already had 100 times over. Vance Builders was his, all of it, every truck, every contract, every permit and parcel. He'd started the company at 26 with $9,000 he'd saved over 4 years of doing subcontract work for other people. Now they had 11 active projects across the city and a portfolio worth more than anyone in his family had ever imagined. He'd also built his own house, by hand. Not as a symbol, not to make a point. He just wanted to know it was done right. By 7 that evening, the house was quiet. Tony sat across from him at the long dining room table, pushing a piece of salmon around her plate. She was dressed like she had somewhere else to be. Pearl earrings, good blouse, hair done. They were eating at home. "Margot asked if we were coming to the Aldridge benefit next month," she said, not really to him. More to the room. "Probably," Julian said. "When is it?" "A Saturday." She set her fork down. "You'd need to wear the gray suit, not the one with the missing button." Julian looked at her. "I'll get the button fixed." "That's not really the point, Julian." He waited. "The point," she said, picking up her fork again, "is that you told her husband you'd get eyes on his property like you were quoting a job estimate. These are people I've spent 2 years building relationships with." Julian cut a piece of his food and ate it. He didn't argue. There wasn't much to argue about. He had said that, and he'd meant it as a compliment. Tony's phone buzzed on the table. She'd placed it face down when she sat, which she'd been doing for a few weeks now. She glanced at it without flipping it over, then back at her plate. "I canceled the Napa trip," she said. Julian set his fork down slowly. "You canceled it." "My schedule is a disaster right now. The Foundation Gala is that same weekend, and I'm co-chair this year." She said it the same way she said everything lately, like the conversation was already finished before it started. "We can rebook for the fall. We've moved it twice, and we'll book it again in the fall." She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you can find something to do with a free weekend." He didn't push it. He just watched her for a moment. The way she was already drifting back to her phone, the way her shoulders relaxed the second she thought he'd let it go. And then he picked up his fork and finished eating. Preston called at 9. Julian was in his home office when the phone rang. He and Preston had been friends since their second year of college. 20 years. Preston had been with him almost from the beginning of the company, and now held a minority stake in it. "Hey," Preston said. His voice was moving, like he was walking somewhere fast. "I've got to push our Thursday meeting. Something came up." "What came up?" "Client thing. I'll explain later." A pause, a door closing somewhere on his end. "We'll get it rescheduled." "All right," Julian said. That was it. Call over. Julian held the phone in his hand for a moment after the line went dead. Preston never cut calls short. Preston liked to talk. His mother showed up at 9:30. Harriet Vance knocked twice and walked in like she always had. She set a foil-covered dish on the kitchen counter, looked around the house with sharp, quiet eyes, and said, "Where's Antoinette?" "Upstairs." Harriet nodded slowly. She sat at the kitchen island and folded her hands. "Something is wrong with that woman," she said, "and something is wrong with Preston." "Mama, I'm not asking you to agree with me." She looked at him straight. "I'm telling you. So you've been told." Julian smiled a little. "All right. Don't smile at me like I'm being foolish." "I'm not." She studied him for a long second, then stood and kissed him on the forehead. After she left, Julian went back to his office. There was a financial report on his desk that Preston had emailed over that afternoon. A quarterly summary of vendor costs and subcontractor draws. Julian had read it once already. Now he read it again, slower. Something wasn't adding up. He closed the folder, opened his desk drawer, and pulled out a notepad. He wrote one name on it. Desmond. Desmond Farrow was the kind of man who ironed his shirts the night before and arrived 15 minutes early to everything. Julian had hired him 3 years ago on the recommendation of a retired banker who described him simply as, "He's quiet, but he catches everything." That had been enough. Julian was already in the conference room when Desmond knocked on the half-open door at 7:50 in the morning. He came in carrying a manila folder pressed flat under one arm, the way someone carries something they don't want bent or dropped. "Close it," Julian said, nodding toward the door. Desmond closed it, sat across from Julian, and placed the folder on the table. "I wasn't sure whether to bring this to you or—" He stopped. "You brought it to me," Julian said. "That's the right call. What have you got?" Desmond opened the folder. Inside were 3 printed sheets of account activity, rows of numbers, dates, vendor codes, and payment amounts. He turned them to face Julian and pointed to a column near the right margin. "These are vendor payments, subcontractor draws, mostly. That's how they're logged. Approved under Mr. Wade's signing authority over the last 18 months. He slid his finger down the column. "But the payee code on all of them routes to this account." He tapped a number circled in red pen. "I went back through our vendor list 3 times. That account number doesn't match any contractor we've ever used." Julian looked at the numbers. He didn't speak right away. "How much?" he asked. Desmond straightened slightly. $114,000. Across 19 separate transactions. The room was very quiet. Julian picked up one of the pages and read across a few of the rows. The payment amounts were spread out, never too large, never too small, consistent, patient, the kind of pattern that was designed to stay hidden inside normal-looking noise. "Do you know where this account routes to?" Julian asked. "Not yet. I'd need to pull the original payment records from the bank directly. The internal logs only show the account number." Julian set the page down flat. "Pull them. Do it quietly. through the business banking rep we use. Tell her it's a routine audit reconciliation." He looked at Desmond directly. "You don't talk to Preston about this. You don't mention it to anyone in the office. If Preston asks what you're working on, you tell him payroll reconciliation. You understand?" Desmond nodded. "Yes, sir." "If anything else turns up while you're pulling those records, you call my cell. Not the office line. Mine." "Understood." Julian closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "You did the right thing bringing this to me, Desmond." Desmond picked up the folder and stood. He gave one small, careful nod, the nod of a man who understood the weight of what was sitting in his hands, and left the room without another word. Julian got home at 8:15 that evening. Tony's car was in the driveway, a white SUV she'd leased 2 years ago and kept immaculate. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the TV was on upstairs. Tony called down that she'd already eaten and that there were leftovers in the fridge. Julian said all right. He ate alone in the kitchen. Then he remembered he'd left his site inspection binder in Tony's car from the weekend when she'd given him a ride after his truck went in for service. He grabbed her keys from the hook by the door and went back outside. The binder was on the back seat. He grabbed it. He was about to close the door when something caught his eye. A faint rectangular outline in the charger console between the front seats. The regular phone cubby was empty, but the secondary tray underneath, the one most people used for loose change or mints, had something in it. A phone, small and dark, sitting face down. Julian stood very still. He reached in and picked it up. It wasn't locked. The screen woke up and opened directly into a message thread. The name at the top was P. He read. He stood in the cold dark of the driveway and read every message in that thread from the last 2 months. His face didn't move. His breathing stayed steady. But his jaw tightened once, just once, and then went smooth again. The affair was right there in plain language. Timestamps, arrangements, details he didn't need to read twice to understand. And then, near the top of the thread, the newest message, sent 4 days ago, from Tony to Preston. "Once he signs the refinance paperwork, the house is basically mine on paper. Then we push him out." Julian stared at that line for a long time. Then he took out his own phone and photographed every screen, every message, every date. He went back far enough to find the beginning of the thread and photographed that too. He put Tony's phone back exactly where he'd found it, face down, same angle, same position. He closed the car door, picked up his binder, walked inside. He ate the leftovers Tony had mentioned. He washed his dish. He said good night to her at the top of the stairs, his voice the same as it always was. Then he went to bed. He was up at 4:30. He dressed in the dark, went downstairs, and walked out to his truck. He sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The street was black and still. He pulled out his phone and called Odessa Marsh. She picked up on the second ring. "Odessa," he said, "I need you, right now." Odessa Marsh's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that looked like it had been built to outlast everything around it. Heavy stone facade, brass letters above the entrance, the kind of building that said permanence without trying. Julian arrived at 5:45 in the morning. Odessa was already there. She met him at the door to her private office herself, not a receptionist. She was a small woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back tight and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a pressed blouse, looking like she'd been awake for an hour already. Maybe 2. "Sit," she said. Julian sat. He laid his phone on the desk between them, opened to the photographs. He told her everything. The Shell account, Desmond's numbers, the second phone in the car, the messages, the name P at the top of the thread. He spoke plainly and in order, the way he would brief a foreman before a pour. No emotion, no stumbling, just the facts, each one placed down like a brick. Odessa listened without interrupting. She picked up his phone partway through and scrolled slowly through the photographs. Her face didn't change. When he finished, she set the phone down and looked at him over the top of her glasses. "The refinance paperwork," she said. "When did she have you sign it?" "About 6 weeks ago. She put it in front of me with a stack of other documents. Said it was routine, end-of-year stuff." Odessa was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder. She set it in front of him. "My firm has a standing relationship with the county recorder's office," she said. "We run title scans on all active properties for our retained clients twice a year. Standard practice." She tapped the folder. "We flagged a pending equity restructure on your home address 10 days ago. It looked irregular. We froze the filing before it could record." Julian looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "You froze it before I even called you?" "Yes." "So it never went through?" "Not a single page of it recorded," Odessa said. "The deed still reads exactly as it did the day you closed on that property, which, if I recall, was in your name alone." Julian leaned back slowly in his chair. He thought about Tony's text message. Once he signs the refinance paperwork, the house is basically mine on paper. She didn't know it hadn't filed. She'd been walking around for 10 days believing she already had the house. "She doesn't know," he said. "No," Odessa said. "She doesn't." Odessa folded her hands on the desk. "Julian, I want to tell you what I think is about to happen. You've been quieter at home. Your behavior has changed, even slightly. People like Tony, people running a plan, they read that. They may not know what you know, but they'll feel the shift." She paused. "They may decide to move before you do." Julian nodded slowly. He'd already thought about that. He'd thought about it in the dark of his truck at 4:30 in the morning, sitting in front of the house he'd built with his own hands. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Nothing you haven't already given me," Odessa said. "Give me until noon. I'll have a team assembled." He was 40 minutes from the house when his phone rang. The name on the screen was his neighbor, Ray Coulter, retired. Walked his dog at the same time every evening and always waved from the end of the driveway. Julian answered. "Julian." Ray's voice was low and uncomfortable. "I don't know what's going on over here, but your wife is throwing things out the front door. Bags, boxes. There's a man parked out front I don't recognize." Julian kept his eyes on the road. "Thank you, Ray." "You want me to—" "No, I'm on my way." He ended the call. In his rearview mirror, 2 black SUVs held steady behind him. They'd been there since he'd pulled out of the parking structure downtown. 10 attorneys from Marsh and Associates. Odessa in the lead vehicle. Julian drove the rest of the way without hurrying. He turned onto his street and saw it from a block away. His duffel bag sat open on the front lawn, a suitcase beside it, one wheel broken off, lying on its side. A cardboard box had split and scattered papers across the grass. His clothes, his things, his life, distributed across a yard he'd seeded and sodded himself 6 years ago. Preston's silver car sat idling at the curb. Tony stood on the porch steps in a cream blouse, her arms crossed, her chin high. She looked like she'd rehearsed this, like she'd imagined exactly how it would go. Julian parked and stepped out of his truck. "Get out!" Tony's voice cracked across the neighborhood like a whip. "This is my house now, Julian. We are done. I want you off this property." Julian didn't answer. He stood beside his truck door and looked at her. Just looked. Behind him, both SUVs pulled to the curb. 4 doors opened, then 4 more, then the rest. 10 attorneys spread across the lawn in dark suits, stepping carefully around the scattered luggage. Odessa Marsh came last, unhurried, a leather portfolio under one arm. Tony's mouth was still open. The words had stopped coming. Odessa walked to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice calm and clear enough for every neighbor on the block to hear, "the refinance filing you've been counting on was flagged and frozen 10 days ago. It never recorded. The deed to this property remains unchanged." She tucked the portfolio under her arm and held Tony's eyes. "Additionally, as of 7 o'clock this morning, the accounts in question are subject to an active fraud investigation. I'd strongly suggest you contact an attorney." Tony looked at Preston's car, then back at Odessa, then at Julian. Julian looked at his wife, really looked at her, one final time, and said, "This isn't me leaving. This is me finally showing you what you've actually been standing on." He turned and walked up the porch steps, past her, and back into his own house. The elevator opened onto the 14th floor at 7:15 the next morning. Julian stepped off carrying 2 coffees and a brown paper bag from the diner 2 blocks down. He hadn't slept much, but he'd eaten and he'd showered, and he'd made his bed before he left. Small things mattered. They always had. Odessa's conference room was already lit. Desmond Farrow sat at one end of the long table with his laptop open and a stack of printed spreadsheets arranged in neat rows in front of him. He looked up when Julian came in. His eyes were tired, and there was something in them that wasn't just fatigue. Something that looked like guilt, though it wasn't his to carry. "Morning," Julian said. He set one of the coffees beside Desmond's keyboard without being asked. Desmond said, "Thank you," quietly, and looked back at his screen. Odessa came in from the side door with her own coffee and a legal pad already half filled with notes. She sat down and looked at both of them. "Let's start with the numbers," she said. "Desmond." Desmond cleared his throat. He turned his laptop to face Julian and tapped the screen. "I went back further," he said. "Past the 18 months I flagged originally. I kept finding the same pattern. Vendor payments to the same shell account, all approved under Preston's signing authority. I kept pulling." He paused. "It doesn't start 18 months ago, Julian. It starts almost 4 years ago." Julian looked at the screen. The earliest date in the first column sat there in plain black type. 2 months after his wedding. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the number at the bottom of the page. $1.4 million, Desmond said. $1,412,000. Spread across 41 transactions over 46 months, routed into a joint account registered to 2 names. He didn't read the names out loud. He didn't need to. Julian already knew them. Julian sat back in his chair. He picked up his coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the table. 4 years. Preston had stood at the altar beside him, had handed him the ring, had clapped him on the back and said, "Brother, you deserve this." And the whole time, before the reception was even over, it seemed, the plan had already begun. "He was your best man," Desmond said very softly. He wasn't being dramatic. He just couldn't seem to stop himself from saying it. "Yeah," Julian said. "He was." He set his coffee down. "Keep going." Desmond nodded. He walked through the rest of it, the account structure, the way the payments were spaced to avoid triggering internal review thresholds, the vendor names that turned out to be empty LLCs with no actual activity. It was meticulous work, built to be invisible, the kind of plan that assumed the person being stolen from would never look. Julian thought about that. He'd built a company from 1 truck and a borrowed trailer. He'd read every contract, every invoice, every draw schedule for years, until the company grew large enough that he'd had to delegate. And that was when it had started. Right at the moment he'd finally trusted someone else enough to let go. He stored that thought away and didn't say it out loud. When Desmond finished, Odessa took over. "The company," Julian said before she could start. "I want operations running like nothing happened. Job sites open, crews on schedule. Clients hear nothing." "Agreed," Odessa said. "Disruption serves no one but them right now." "Make sure Desmond has what he needs to keep payroll clean through the end of the month. I'll handle the foreman briefings myself." Odessa made a note. Then she folded her hands and laid out what she'd been building since the night before. 3 parallel tracks, she said. The first is a criminal fraud referral to the DA's office. What we have, the shell accounts, the forged signing authority, the documented pattern across 4 years, is strong enough to warrant it, and I want it filed before either of them retains counsel and starts shredding. Julian nodded. Second, a civil recovery suit. We go after every dollar. The stolen funds, the accounts they're sitting in, and any other assets tied to those accounts. We won't get it all overnight, but we will get it. And the third, Julian said. Divorce, Odessa said simply. Anchored by the prenuptial agreement. A short silence. Tony thinks that prenup is a dead letter, Julian said. She said so herself about 3 years in. Said it would never hold up. Odessa looked at him over her reading glasses. She was wrong, she said. I drafted it. It holds up. Julian thought about the look on Tony's face on the porch, the confidence in it, the certainty that she'd already won. All 3, he said. Start all of them, today. Odessa uncapped her pen and began writing. By 1 in the afternoon, Julian was back on the job site. He walked the east framing with his site foreman, checking the load calculations on the second-floor deck, asking questions about material delivery timelines for the following week. His boots were muddy. His tape measure was on his belt. He worked through the afternoon as planned. 2 days passed. Julian kept to his routine. Job site at dawn. Office by 10. Home by dark. He didn't vary it. Routine was a kind of armor, and he'd learned a long time ago that the best way to keep people from reading you was to give them nothing new to look at. On the 3rd morning, he drove to Odessa's office. She met him in the conference room with a single manila folder laid flat on the table in front of his chair. Not a stack this time, just the one. Sit down, she said. He sat. She opened the folder herself and turned it so it faced him. It was a photocopy of the document, the refinance paperwork Tony had set in front of him one Saturday morning about 6 weeks back, on the kitchen counter beside his coffee, dressed up in a stack of other forms Tony had described as just routine maintenance stuff. The accountant flagged a few things. He'd flipped through it. He'd seen the refinance language, the bank headers, the legal boilerplate. He'd signed. He'd been a fool. Except, he looked at the highlighted section near the bottom of page 4. He hadn't made it that far that morning. Not with Tony standing there talking about her mother's birthday dinner and asking if he wanted eggs. Read the highlighted clause, Odessa said. He read it. It was buried in the kind of language designed to be skipped. Dense paragraphs, small font, indented subclauses. But the meaning was plain enough once you slowed down. The document wasn't just a refinance. Tucked inside it was a partial equity transfer, not of the house, but of Julian's company shares in Vance Builders, 7% of his majority stake, assigned to Preston Wade as a consideration of partnership restructuring. 7%. Quietly. On a Saturday morning beside his coffee, Julian set the paper down. The notary, Odessa said. She tapped the signature block at the bottom, a name and a stamp. We pulled her records. I had one of my associates call her directly. Odessa paused. She has no record of witnessing this document. She said she would never have notarized a business equity transfer through a residential refinance packet. She recognized something was off about the request. She was contacted by someone claiming to be a paralegal from a firm she'd never heard of. Odessa's voice stayed flat. Her stamp was copied from another document. She never signed this. Julian looked at the stamp. Clean, official, completely fake. Forgery, he said. Forgery, Odessa confirmed, and notarial fraud. Both carry felony exposure. We're no longer talking about embezzlement alone. He thought about Preston sitting at his wedding reception, toasting him in front of 60 people. He thought about Tony placing that stack of papers on the counter, casual as setting down a glass of water, knowing exactly what was buried inside it. Add it to the file, Julian said. First thing tomorrow, Odessa said. I want it formally documented and cross-referenced with the criminal referral before we hand anything to the DA. Good. He drove home. She was already in the driveway when he pulled in. Tony's car was parked crooked near the garage door, like she'd arrived fast and stopped faster. She was standing beside it in a light gray coat, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes red in a way that looked like she'd been working on them for the last 30 minutes. She stepped toward him as he got out of the truck. Julian! Her voice was soft, careful. I need to talk to you. Please. He didn't say anything. He closed the truck door and stood still. I know how this all looks, she said. I know, but you have to understand that things got out of hand. I made mistakes. We both did. She pressed a hand to her chest. I still love you. I want you to know that. Whatever has happened, that part is real. He watched her face. He'd read blueprints for 20 years. He knew how to look at a structure and find where the weight wasn't sitting right. I think we can fix this, she said. If we just talk, without lawyers, without all of this. She gestured vaguely, meaning, he understood, everything she couldn't name because she didn't know how much of it existed. That was the thing she didn't know he knew. He let her finish. Then he said, I hear you. That was all. She blinked. She'd been expecting something, a door opening or a door slamming, not nothing. So can we sit down somewhere and— You should go, Tony, he said. Quiet, even. The same voice he used to tell a crew to stop work before a storm. Her expression shifted, just slightly, like she was recalibrating. Julian, good night, he said. He walked to his front door and went inside. He stood in his entryway for a moment in the dark, listening to her car start and back out of the driveway. Then he took out his phone and called Odessa. She picked up on the second ring. She came by, Julian said. I expected she might, Odessa said. The forgery findings, he said. I want them added to the case file first thing tomorrow morning, formally, everything. Already on my calendar for 7 a.m., she said. Consider it done. Good, he said. He hung up. Harriet Vance walked into Julian's office at 9:30, carrying a manila folder thick enough to bend at the spine. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She'd been walking into rooms without knocking since before Julian could reach a doorknob, and at 67 years old she had no interest in starting new habits. She dropped the folder on his desk. Sit down, she said. Same words Odessa had used 2 days ago. Different energy entirely. Odessa's version was the calm of a surgeon scrubbing in. Harriet's version was the energy of a woman who'd been right for years and was finally being allowed to prove it. Julian sat. I went through everything, she said, pulling the chair across from his desk close and sitting down without being invited. "Every email you forwarded me, the ones from the wedding planning, the venue deposits, the caterer back and forths, all of it." She tapped the folder, and then I went looking through my own inbox. "Because I kept things, Julian. I always kept things." He opened the folder. On top was a printed email chain. The dates in the header read 11 months before the wedding. The sender was Tony's mother, Cecile Boudreau. The recipient was Tony. Harriet had highlighted a paragraph near the bottom in yellow. He read it. "Preston has already made arrangements on his end. Your father and I are comfortable with the structure as discussed. The important thing now is making sure Julian doesn't insist on overly protective language in the prenuptial agreement. We've spoken to him about keeping the peace. Don't let this become adversarial." Julian set the page down. "Keep reading," Harriet said. He turned to the next sheet. Another email, this one from 2 weeks later, between Tony's father, Gerald Boudreau, and a name Julian didn't recognize, a private financial advisor based in New Orleans. The highlighted line read, "The internal transfer framework T&P have agreed to will need a period of time to establish cleanly." The prenup language Julian's attorney proposed would complicate that significantly. "Gerald is handling it from the family side. Gerald is handling it from the family side." Julian remembered that conversation. He'd been sitting in the den of the Boudreau house in Metairie, Gerald across from him with a glass of bourbon, friendly as a man at a cookout. He'd said something about not wanting lawyers to poison what was supposed to be a celebration. He'd called the prenup protections unnecessarily cold. He'd said Tony was hurt by some of the clauses. He'd said we're all family now. Julian had agreed to soften 2 provisions. He'd thought he was being reasonable. He'd thought he was choosing peace. He closed the folder. "They knew," he said. "From before the wedding," Harriet said. "Before the vows, before the cake, before any of it." Her voice was controlled, but her jaw was set in the way it always got when she was furious and choosing not to be loud about it. "That family sat across from you and called you son, and they already knew what that girl and your partner had cooking." Julian said nothing for a moment. "I need the originals," he said, "or access to the accounts they were sent from." "I already called your Odessa," Harriet said. "She's sending someone to my house this afternoon to do whatever it is they do. Pull the metadata," she called it. She waved a hand. I don't know what that means, but she seemed pleased. Julian almost smiled. "It means she can prove the emails are real." "Good," Harriet said, "because they are." His phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. The name on the screen was Marcus Webb, one of Vance Builder's 3 outside investors, a commercial real estate developer out of Baton Rouge who'd been with the company for 6 years, a careful, deliberate man who did not call in the middle of a Tuesday without a reason. Julian answered. "Julian." Marcus's voice was measured, careful. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it straight from me before you hear it another way." "Go ahead." "Preston Wade called a meeting this morning with myself, Doug Terrell, and Fontaine's group. He told us you've been mismanaging capital, that you've been emotionally unstable since some personal difficulties at home, and that you've made several decisions recently that put the company's financial position at risk." A pause. "He said he wanted us to consider a temporary change in operational authority." Julian was quiet. "He said he was protecting the company," Marcus added. "His words." "Marcus," Julian said, "are you available this evening?" "I'll make myself available." "I'm going to have my attorney present some information to you, Doug, and Fontaine's group, tonight, if they can make it." "What kind of information?" "The kind," Julian said, That explains exactly what Preston Wade has been doing with company money for the last 4 years. There was a brief silence on the line. "Tell me where," Marcus said. "We'll be there." Odessa's conference room held all of them by 6 o'clock. Marcus Webb, Doug Terrell, a representative from the Fontaine Investment Group, a woman named Clara Park, who took notes in a small leather notebook without looking up. Odessa, at the head of the table with Desmond beside her, a laptop open, a printed summary already laid at each chair. Julian sat to Odessa's right and said almost nothing. He didn't need to. Desmond walked them through the numbers. 4 years, 14 separate shell transactions, $1.4 million. Then Odessa laid the forgery findings on top, the buried share transfer, the copied notary stamp, the confirmation from the notary herself. Clara Park stopped writing and looked up for the first time. Doug Terrell leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Lord." Marcus Webb looked at Julian for a long moment. "You've known about this for how long?" "Long enough to build a case," Julian said. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he turned to the others. The vote to suspend Preston Wade's signing authority was unanimous. It took less than 4 minutes. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. It was sitting on Julian's desk when he got in from the site, still in his work boots, dust from the Carrollton project on the back of his forearms. His assistant had left it on top of everything else, which meant she'd thought it was important. She was right. The return address was a law firm. Holloway and Bro. He'd never heard of them, but the letterhead was the kind with thick ink and a gold seal, the kind designed to make you feel small before you'd even read the first line. He opened it standing up. Notice of mediation request. Vance vs. Vance. Tony's new attorneys were requesting a joint mediation session to resolve what they called the disputed primary residence equity transfer and related marital asset division. They had a proposed date. They had a proposed neutral location. They had 3 paragraphs of careful legal language describing how they believed the equity in the house had been substantially reallocated by the refinance documentation signed by Julian earlier that year. Julian read the letter twice. Then he set it down, sat back in his chair, and thought about the fact that Holloway and Bro had no idea the refinance filing had been voided weeks ago. They were building their whole strategy on a document that no longer existed in the form they thought it did. They were preparing to walk into a room with a hand they were certain was strong. He picked up his phone and called Odessa. "I got it," he said. "I know," she said. "They copied me. I've been waiting for you to call." "They think the house equity is still in play." "They do," Odessa said, "which means Tony either doesn't know the filing was voided, or she knows and hasn't told her attorneys yet. Either way, they're coming in blind." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Set the date," he said. "Whatever works for you. I want to be ready." They spent the following week getting ready. Odessa's team had been building the case in layers for weeks already, but now they consolidated everything into a single complete record. Every piece of it organized, sequenced, and sourced. The embezzlement records. 14 transactions over 4 years, each one traced back to its origin and its destination. Desmond's work, meticulous and airtight. The forgery findings. The buried share transfer clause. The notary's signed statement confirming she had never witnessed Julian's signature. The copied stamp. The frozen accounts. Court documentation confirming every relevant account had been placed under legal hold, including the joint accounts Tony and Preston had used to receive the diverted funds. The completed criminal fraud referral. Already filed. Already in the hands of the appropriate authorities. Not a threat. A fact. And underneath all of it, quiet and steady as a load-bearing wall, the prenuptial agreement. the one Tony had called a piece of paper at a dinner party 3 years into the marriage, laughing like it was an old joke. The one Gerald Boudreau had worked to soften before the ink was ever dry. It had held. Every provision they hadn't managed to water down had held completely. Odessa called it the cleanest prenup I've seen enforced in 20 years. Julian just called it the thing he'd insisted on. He called Harriet on a Tuesday evening. "The mediation is next week," he said. "Thursday morning." "I'll be home all day," she said immediately, as if she'd been waiting for this call for 11 days. "You call me the minute it's done." "I will." "You're going to be in that room with her," Harriet said. It wasn't a question. It was something else. A mother taking the measure of her son's readiness. "Yes," Julian said. A pause. "You'll be fine," she said. "You've always done better when things are real. When there's something in front of you that you can actually work with." She paused again. "Just don't let her cry at you and lose the thread." "I won't." He called Desmond next. Desmond said he'd keep his phone on and his files open, that he could be reached instantly if any numbers needed clarifying in the room. Julian thanked him and meant it. The night before the mediation, Julian drove back to Odessa's office at 7 o'clock. She'd cleared her conference table. Every document was spread across it in order, grouped by subject, labeled in the top right corner with small adhesive tabs. Red for financial records, blue for legal filings, yellow for the forgery case, green for the prenup and divorce filing. They went through it together for 2 hours. Julian read every page himself, not because he didn't trust Odessa's team, because he needed to know every inch of it in his own hands before he walked into that room. He asked questions. She answered. He flagged 2 small items he wanted clarified, and she made notes. By 9 o'clock, there were no gaps left. There was nothing that could be challenged that they hadn't already shored up. The case was complete. Odessa walked him to the door. "I'll handle the procedural language," she said. "The filings, the formalities, whatever the other side's attorney needs to hear in legal terms." Julian nodded. He put on his jacket. "But the facts," he said. "I want to deliver those myself, in my own words, when everyone's in the room." Odessa looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Then we go Thursday," she said. The mediation room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with tall windows and a long table made of dark wood that probably cost more than Julian's first truck. "Neutral territory," the notice had said. "A professional setting." Julian arrived early. He and Odessa took the left side of the table. 2 members of her team sat beside them, folders stacked neatly in front of them, everything in order. Julian set nothing on the table. No folders, no papers. He'd read every page the night before. He didn't need them in front of him now. Tony arrived 7 minutes late. She came in with her attorney, a tall man in a charcoal suit who carried himself like someone used to winning, and she was dressed carefully. Dark blouse, pearl earrings, hair pulled back. She looked composed from the doorway, but Julian had spent 12 years reading her face, and what he saw when her eyes landed on Odessa's full team wasn't composure. It was a small, fast recalculation. Preston came in behind them. He wore a navy jacket over an open collar, and when he walked through the door, he gave the room a quick scan, the way a man does when he's trying to look relaxed and isn't. He found Julian's face. Julian looked back at him without expression and said nothing. They all sat down. Tony's attorney, his name was Holloway, the name from the letterhead, arranged his papers and offered a brief, prepared statement about the purpose of the session. "The house equity," he said, "the marital asset in question." He used the word reallocated twice. Julian let him finish. Then Odessa said calmly, "Mr. Vance would like to address the room before we proceed." Holloway looked slightly put out, but nodded. "Of course." Julian folded his hands on the table. He looked at Tony first, then at Preston, then at Holloway. "I'm going to tell you what this case is actually about," he said. "Not what you think it's about, what it actually is." His voice was even, no heat in it. 4 years ago," he said, "money started leaving my company. Not in large amounts at first, small enough not to trigger anything automatic. It went into a vendor account I never set up, approved under Preston's signing authority." He looked at Preston when he said this. Preston's jaw moved slightly, but he said nothing. "Over 4 years, that account received $1.4 million, Julian said. The forwarding address for that account's bank statements was Tony's private P.O. box. He looked at Tony now. The account was jointly controlled by both of them. Tony's face stayed still. Too still. Julian continued. "The refinance paperwork Tony had me sign, the paperwork your firm believes established equity leverage over our home, contained a second item buried in the signature pages, a partial transfer of my company shares to Preston." He paused, letting that sit. "The notarization on that page was fraudulent. The notary on record has provided a signed statement confirming she never witnessed my signature. She didn't stamp that document. Someone used a copy of her stamp." Holloway had stopped writing. His pen was still in his hand, but it wasn't moving. "The affair between Tony and Preston began well before the marriage hit any difficulty," Julian said. "I have the messages. I have the timeline. Preston was my best man. He let that land without adding anything to it." Then Odessa opened a folder and slid 3 documents across the table. She did it without drama, the way a person sets a tool down after finishing a job. "The refinance filing your firm is relying on was voided prior to your mediation request," she said to Holloway. Her voice was precise and without apology. "Every relevant account is currently under legal hold by court order, and the criminal fraud referral, covering embezzlement, forgery, and notarial fraud, was filed 11 days ago. That is not a pending action. It has already been submitted." Holloway picked up the top document. He read the first page. Then he looked at Tony. It was a short look, but it said everything. Tony's eyes dropped to the table. Preston shifted in his chair. He looked at Julian across the dark wood of the table, and something moved across his face. Something that wasn't quite shame, but was trying to dress like it. "Julian?" His voice was quiet, almost careful. "I know what this looks like, I know that. But think about everything we built together. You and me. Before any of this, that was real. All of it. You know that." Julian looked at him. He didn't look away. He didn't look angry. He just looked at Preston the way a man looks at something he's already finished measuring. "What we built," Julian said, "you were stealing from while we built it." He paused. "That's not something I missed, Preston. That's the whole story." He let one beat of silence settle in the room. "This is the last conversation we have as anything other than opposing parties in court," he said. "That's not a threat. That's just what's true now." Preston said nothing. Julian pushed back his chair and stood. He looked at Odessa. "I have nothing further to discuss outside of formal proceedings," he said. Odessa closed her folder, rose beside him, and together they walked out of the room. Tony's parents requested the meeting. That surprised Julian, but not much. He'd expected some version of it. An attempt to smooth things over, maybe, or to understand the scope of what was coming before it landed on them publicly. Either way, he agreed to it. He had things to say that needed to be said to their faces. They met at a quiet restaurant near their neighborhood. A Tuesday afternoon, almost no one else there. Her father, Gerald, arrived in a sport coat he'd clearly pressed for the occasion. Her mother, Diane, wore a silk blouse and a look Julian had seen before. The practiced calm of a woman who'd spent decades managing other people's discomfort before it could become hers. They ordered coffee. They made small talk for about 30 seconds before Gerald said, "We just want to understand what happened." Julian set down his cup. "I think you already understand more than you're telling me," he said. "But I'll go through it anyway." He did, plainly in order, without raising his voice once. The 4 years of missing money. The Shell account with Tony's P.O. box. The affair. The forged signature page buried in paperwork Tony had put in front of him herself. He told them about the notary fraud. He told them about the criminal referral already filed. Then he told them what Harriet had found. He slid a single printed page across the table, a copy of one email, an old one, from a chain between Gerald and Tony before the wedding. In it, Gerald had written, "The arrangement with Preston is fine as long as Julian doesn't ask questions. Just keep things tidy." Diane's hand moved toward her coffee cup and stopped. Gerald looked at the page for a long moment. Then he looked up. "That wasn't what it—" "I know what it looks like to you," Julian said. "I know you probably told yourself it was just family business, that it was just Tony being Tony and Preston being helpful, and none of it was serious." He paused. "But your daughter spent 4 years stealing from my company. Preston spent 4 years sleeping with my wife and robbing me at the same time. And you both knew something was arranged between them before I ever walked her down that aisle." The table was quiet. Diane's carefully managed expression had come apart by then. Not into tears. Into something older and harder than tears. Into the look of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't like the total of. Gerald started to say something else. Julian held up one hand, not aggressive, just final. "I'm not here for an apology," he said. "I don't need one. I came because you asked me to, and because I thought you deserved to hear it from me, instead of reading it in a filing." He stood. "What happens with your daughter after this is between you and her." He left the money for the coffee on the table and walked out. The consequences came in sequence, the way structural failures do, one load-bearing thing giving way, then the next, then the next. Preston was formally removed from Vance Builders the same week the forgery finding was certified. His shares, obtained fraudulently, were voided and returned to the company. He was escorted out of the office by building security on a Wednesday morning, with a box of his desk items and no ceremony. The criminal referral was already filed. His attorney confirmed receipt. Tony's separate assets were pulled into the civil judgment. The court ordered full recovery of the stolen $1.4 million, plus damages, from their jointly held accounts, and from whatever Tony had moved into her own name. The accounts were already frozen. There wasn't much she could hide that hadn't already been found. The prenuptial agreement held. Tony's divorce attorney had tried 3 different angles on it. Odessa answered each one with the same patience a teacher shows a student who keeps getting the same problem wrong. The prenup was valid, signed, witnessed correctly, and ironclad. Tony left the marriage with exactly what she'd brought into it. Not the house, not the accounts, not a piece of the company she'd spent 4 years trying to quietly take apart. Neither Preston nor Tony was offered any conversation beyond what moved through counsel. Preston called Julian's cell phone twice. Julian didn't answer either time and didn't call back. Tony sent a letter through her attorney that tried one last time to frame the whole thing as a shared failure, A marriage that had simply broken down. Odessa responded on Julian's behalf with a single paragraph citing ongoing litigation. There was nothing else to say. He got home late that evening. The house was quiet. The porch light was on. He'd left it on out of habit, and it threw a yellow circle across the front steps and out onto the lawn. The same lawn where his bags had been scattered across the grass, where Tony had stood on those steps and screamed at him, where Preston's car had idled at the curb like a man waiting to inherit something. Julian sat down on the top step. The neighborhood was still. A dog barked somewhere down the block, then stopped. The air smelled like cut grass and the faint trace of coming rain. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the lawn. His lawn, his steps, his house, every beam of it measured and set by his own hands. He sat there for a long time without moving. The sign went up on a Thursday morning. Julian stood back and watched the crew bolt the last corner bracket into place. The metal was brushed steel, clean lines, letters cut deep. Vance Developments, the Raymond Wing Raymond, his father's name. The old man had worked concrete his whole life, never owned a company, never owned much of anything, really. Just showed up, did the work, came home tired and honest. Julian had learned to read a level and tie rebar from his father's hands before he ever read a blueprint. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He thought about it now. He stood there in the morning sun with his coffee going cold in his hand and let himself feel it, just for a minute. The weight of it. The good kind of weight. Then his site foreman called something across the lot, and Julian put his coffee down and went back to work. The company had grown. That was the simplest way to say it. The recovered funds, all $1.4 million plus damages, had come back into Vance Builders like a tide returning. Julian had moved carefully with it. No flash, no announcements. He put it into 2 new projects that had been waiting on capital, hired 6 more crew members, and opened a small development wing that focused on mixed-income housing, the kind of building his father would have actually lived in. Desmond Farrow was now Chief Financial Officer. Julian had told him in a short meeting, the same way he told people most things, directly and without a lot of decoration. "You found it," Julian said. "You brought it to me when you didn't have to. That matters more than a job title, but you're getting the title, too." Desmond had nodded, looked briefly at his shoes, and said, "I'll do the work." That was it. That was enough. Sunday dinners had changed. Harriet had a chair now, not a guest chair. Her chair, the one at the left end of the table, closest to the kitchen, where she could supervise what was being cooked, and offer opinions no one asked for, and that were always right. She came every week without fail, and she brought something every time. Pound cake. A pot of something that took all morning. Once, inexplicably, a jar of pickled okra that Julian didn't have the heart to tell her he didn't like. He ate the okra. The house itself had been redone in the months after the divorce was finalized, not gutted. Julian wasn't the kind of man who tore things down because they carried a bad memory. He refinished the floors, repainted every room in colors he chose himself, fixed the deck boards he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, put up new lighting in the kitchen that actually made the space feel like a place where someone lived well. It was still the same house. Every beam still his. It just looked like him now. There was also a woman named Clara. She was an architect. She had strong opinions about load-bearing walls and a dry sense of humor that surprised him the first time, and then never stopped surprising him. They'd had dinner 6 times, taken 1 weekend trip to the coast, and established a habit of honest conversation that Julian had not experienced in so long it felt almost foreign at first, like a language he'd known as a child and was slowly remembering how to speak. He didn't rush it. She didn't either. That was the whole point. It was a regular afternoon when he saw Tony. He was running errands, hardware store, then a stop at a kitchen supply place across town he'd been meaning to visit for weeks. He pulled into the strip mall parking lot, checked his list, and walked toward the entrance. The store next door was a mid-range clothing retailer, the kind with bright signage and sale racks pushed out front. He barely glanced at it. Then he did. She was inside, visible through the glass. Tony. Folding sweaters at a display table near the front window, her hair pulled back simply, wearing the store's branded polo shirt. She looked smaller than he remembered, and not because of the shirt. Something about the way she stood, the way she moved. Careful, contained, like a person who had learned to take up less room. He stopped without meaning to. She looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. He watched her go, still. Saw the flash of something move across her face. Recognition, then dread, then the brace of a person waiting for the blow they've earned. She didn't move, didn't look away. He stood there on the sidewalk and looked back at her for one quiet moment. He thought of nothing dramatic. No words he'd saved for this. No version of the lawn in reverse, no crowd, no moment designed for her to feel what he'd felt. He didn't need any of that. He'd already built everything she'd tried to take. He'd built it again. He was still building. Julian gave her one slow, single nod. The same nod from the porch, the same calm. Then he turned and walked into the hardware store. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.